Welcome to With All Due Respect. This is a podcast for women over 40 who are looking for sane, frank advice about their health and wellness, especially through and after menopause. I'm Amanda Thebe, a personal trainer and nutrition coach, and the author of the best-selling book, Menopause: How I Learned to Thrive During Menopause and How You Can Too. I'd love you to join me every week as I chew the fat with some fab guests on hot topics that directly impact you. I also know the power of conversation is lost, and there's nothing better than sitting down for a natter with your mate and putting the world to rights. And that's exactly what I'll be doing with this podcast. We'll really get to know my guests, warts and all. I've made it my mission to help you by exploding a few myths and presenting you with plain, simple facts. These inspiring conversations will hopefully empower you to be a healthy, strong, resilient bitch, just like me. Before we get started, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review, and then visit me at amandathebe.com. And now let's get started on today's show. Hi everyone, welcome back to this week's episode of With All Due Respect with me, Amanda Thebe. I am joined today by Lasara Firefox, who is an American writer, game designer, sex educator, and a neuro-linguistics programming master, practitioner, and trainer. They are a family traditions witch, which I'm going to ask a few questions about, and a second generation ordained priestess, which is very cool too. But that's actually not why I asked Lasara on the show today. I met her through a mutual contribution of an Oprah magazine that made me go, do I really want to do this? But it was just a way to talk about menopause, and Lasara contributed as I did to that. So that was when I became aware of them on my radar. And then also within my Menopausing So Hard group, which is a Facebook group that I don't manage anymore, somebody else does. And we started talking about queer menopause. And that's going to be the topic of the show today. I've already made a mistake because I said she in my introduction, and I'm going to leave it there because I want to get this right. And I want to be open in the fact that I'm learning and things are hard for me to do. But if I want to just start this interview by saying, if I do make any mistakes, please know that it doesn't come from a place of harm. I'm open to learning and I'm happy to be pulled up on this. And so I just want to say welcome to the show. I'm really excited and open and want to do this. So thank you for coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm excited to be here and really excited to meet you after all this time, kind of in person, face to face. And so, and I'm excited to talk about the topics at hand. So, and thank you for your sensitivity. I want to recognize that this learning process is not always comfortable for any of us. And so thank you for entering into a vulnerable and brave space with me.
So let's just talk about that. So I feel like sometimes I'm like, I know I'm not a boomer, but sometimes I have like really boomer moments like I just did then. And it was just because this is so new, but it's not that new. I mean, the changing of the pronouns has definitely been at the forefront for at least the last 10 years, maybe more predominantly like on places like Twitter in the last 5 years. And I'm respectful of them. My kids just get it. Love. It's easier for them than us that didn't grow up like having to like really consider it. So can you sort of like say like, how is that received from, somebody like you that really wants people to recognize the fact that you identify as a they, them? It matters. You put them in your identity and in your profiles everywhere. And it's not just like a way of saying, hey, look at me, I've got pronouns. It actually really means something. So I'd love the conversation to like start there, but talk to us like we know nothing, because I think a lot of us don't know anything.
Okay. Well, I'll start by just saying it's been complicated for me too. I've always been genderqueer. I've identified as genderqueer for a very long time. I've never experienced binary gender as a static thing for me. For me, gender is complex. I find that gender is relational to a large extent. My gender identity can shift somewhat due to interaction, circumstance, who I'm interacting with, what the setting is, and what kind of cues. And some of that is really solid, hard conditioning that I'm working to reformat, right? So I still have an internal process going on around my own gender, right? So I recognize that it's not easy for any of us, including those of us who may identify as non-binary or genderqueer or gender fluid. And those are all different terms, right? Genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, they all mean slightly different things. And honestly, if you talk to two different people who use the same term, they might have different meanings to each person, right? But genderqueer is kind of like a larger category. It's more flexible, like queer is a larger category for many of us. Some people are distinctly uncomfortable with the word queer. And I think that that's a generational thing. For me, taking on the word queer was a reclaiming. And like the word witch, right? They're powerful words that have a lot of both positive and negative kind of load and context culturally. So there's something kind of like rebellious to an extent about taking on the term queer or the term witch. And that is a distinct part of my identity, right? That I am identified with that sort of radicalism that queer represents. And then gender fluid, right? Gender fluid is something I also identify with, though I don't necessarily identify as gender fluid. Gender fluid means that gender is not static, right? Gender fluidity means that you might wake up one day and feel somewhere on the femme spectrum, or you might wake up the next day and feel somewhere on the masc spectrum. And so femme and masc, right? Masculine or masc of center is a term that some folks use. So that means just more on the masculine presenting side. Again, all of these they're complex. They have different meanings in different contexts. And then, but to say a little bit more about gender fluidity, gender is not static. For most of us, gender is not static. I think that ties into menopause too, right? For me, distinctly, my experience of being non-binary and coming out as non-binary coincided for me. It was later in life for me. It coincided with perimenopause. And so that experience of being able to claim my body through the menopause experience, for the first time, not feeling hijacked, right? Postmenopausal now, not feeling hijacked by, quote unquote, female hormone, not feeling like I wasn't in control, right? I was diagnosed with PMDD when I was in my probably 20s, 30s. PMDD is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, for those who are not familiar with the diagnosis. And it just means like PMS on
steroids. Yeah, it's like the worst. Yeah. And so essentially for you, actually losing your reproductive hormones was a sense of relief.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that with women who've had PMDD and endometriosis as well. They're both medical conditions that seem to have a lot of relief after menopause. But
Hold on one second. I want to take this as a teaching moment because you asked me to. So you said women who experience, and I'm using the terminology people who experience menopause, right?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. And so let's talk about that. By the way, I just did a thumbs up to Lasara, sorry. And what's even funnier about that is I read today that doing a thumbs up is a Gen Z term for go fuck yourself. It's passive aggressive. And I'm like, I'm tired. let me do a thumbs up, you little sod. Okay. So let's dig into that. Let's dig into the queer menopause.
Mm-hmm.
And let's talk about an example of that. In my menopause group, we had an exchange of views between women. Actually, I ended up kicking a whole load of women out because it was really an aggressive confrontation, because it's a protective space and everybody is welcome. That's always been my view of a community space. Everyone who experiences menopause can be in that group. And there were people in there denying that there is such a thing as a queer menopause. I've spoken with Tanya Glide, I think you pronounce their name, from the UK, who has a website called Queer Menopause. I don't know if you're aware of them. They're really great resources. But for the general public who have no idea what queer menopause means, can you sort of like explain that to us? Like, what does it mean? What's the difference between you going through menopause and me, or any other queer person going through menopause and me?
So there's a huge category, right? There's a huge category of queer people who go through menopause. There are men who go through menopause. There are trans men who go through menopause. If a trans man decides to supplement with testosterone, for example, they will go through menopause at that point. So that experience of chemical menopause would be part of their transition to, transmasculine presentation and living.
Do they go on like an estrogen progesterone blocker as well? Is that what happens?
In most cases, not. In most cases, the testosterone is sufficient to override that.
Right. So it's the relative levels. It's the relative levels change. Okay.
Yes.
That makes a bit more sense.
So, yeah. And then some trans masculine men choose not to go on hormone therapy, right? They choose to transition maybe with some surgeries or even no surgeries and still be transmasculine identified or even male identified. They may not even identify as transmasculine. And they are going to go through, if they choose not to do supplemental testosterone, they're going to go through menopause naturally at whatever point that their body decides to do that, just like anybody who's not on a hormone regimen. There are non-binary people who go through menopause, and there are queer women who go through menopause. And so I'll tell you a little. Recently, I went to, for the first time in a while, I went to a non-trained, it was a non-trained gynecologist who wasn't trained in gender affirmation, basically. And I had a very interesting experience. She was an amazing gynecologist. She was totally sweet. She had great conversational skills. She listened to everything I had to say. She didn't argue that I was wrong about my body, etc. And throughout, I mentioned that I was non-binary at the beginning and that I used they, them pronouns. Throughout the whole session that we were sitting together, she used the word ladies, women, my ladies, my, etc. throughout the whole, and didn't acknowledge that there were people who were not identified as ladies or women who go through menopause. And that's what I was visiting her about, right? And so it was complicated, right? Because you're in a power differential relationship in that moment, right? So it is challenging to know what level of education that person might be open to, right? So I again affirmed that I was non-binary, but I didn't correct her usage of the term ladies and women. And so I've been reflecting on that. Definitely wish I would have taken action more strongly, because I feel like she may have been open to that exchange. However, you never know. And you never know if, the process of doing that necessary education is going to jeopardize your medical care.
Yes, exactly. Right. So let's just layer on the complexity. Women have been ignored. People, there you go, I'm learning. People have been ignored long enough with regard to menopause. And then finally, you get to see someone who may be educated through North American Menopause Society. So you've got a person with education who's trying to help you. And that's an advancement from where we've been like 10, 15 years ago. And now there's this added layer of complexity where they're going to be presented with people with a uterus, essentially, right? Because that's the common denominator here.
Right.
So it's like, I feel like we're on an evolution and we're going to get it wrong, but we have to be prepared to learn. And if we're not prepared to learn, there's going to be a whole tranche of people out there that are completely ignored, as is typical, right? As you found in many scenarios, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I want to say two things real quick related to what you just said. One is some folks without a uterus will go through because they have their uterus removed in the transmasculine experience. So they no longer have a uterus. They had a uterus, right?
They had a uterus, but the uterus is still a common denominator.
Yes, it is a common denominator. Although also I have heard from, and this is not directly related, but interesting information. I have heard from trans feminine folks that they, with their hormone cycles, experience PMS. They experience hormonal fluctuations, right? In a similar way. So that's an interesting fact.
And I've always been curious about that because they clearly will have to take the female reproductive hormones for the transition. But are they on those forever? Is that a continuum? If they came off, do they then experience the menopause? I've often wondered about that. I don't know anything about it though. Sorry, you had two points.
I don't know as much about that either, but I'm curious to educate myself. What was the other point?
Me too. Yes.
What was the last thing that you said?
There was 2 points you said. There's 2 things that I said, and they were like, the first one is the uterus. The second
one
thing,
forgot, but it'll come back.
Menopause brain. And actually, you know what's really interesting talking about menopause brain is that's one of the things you spoke about in the Oprah article, right? Like that. Can you just talk a little bit about your personal experience?
Absolutely.
Very relatable. Yeah.
One of the things that I've experienced the most distinctly is noun forgetting people's names or forgetting the name of a thing.
Remember the orange? The orange is what you talked about.
Yeah. It's just wild. It's wild. So like having a blank spot where a name should be, it's very complicated. I'm an executive director of a nonprofit organization. I do a lot of out-facing work. Not being able to remember names is really not great. It's a liability. So that has been a real impact. That's been one of the notable impacts for me. And when I first maybe not first, but when I was just getting thoroughly into postmenopausal biology, it got really bad. It got really bad for a little while. And that is when I started supplementing with testosterone, low dose testosterone gel. Yeah. I'm currently not doing that, although it was very helpful in a lot of ways. There were a lot of side effects that I was like not super keen on, which was like I was not ready for the level of masculinization of my features, the amount of like increased body hair. And surprisingly, I hadn't even known this before I started. There's not a lot of education out there, but your hair starts thinning pretty quickly. And
it's male pattern balding happens. Right. But the thing is with testosterone, what the menopause societies are very clear on, and I don't think it's put into practice, is that if a person is supplementing on testosterone, regular blood draws have to happen to make sure they don't exceed the amount. And that's why things like testosterone pellets, while they make people feel amazing because you're getting a steroid-based hormone injected into you, dangerously high levels, and even down to the fact that like voices can change and like irreversibly.
Yes.
So and so there may be some positives, but so it helps cognitively. It's not indicated.
It helps cognitively immensely. I still feel the effect of having even done short-term testosterone supplementation. I really do still feel the effect cognitively.
Or do you think that you maybe, because you said you were postmenopausal, maybe think that also there's some readjustment happening? Because we know that happens with the brain too. It would be nice to have like a bit of a good news story, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I'm doing cognitive skill building, right? So I'm learning a language. I'm learning Scottish Gaelic, as we were talking about before the session started. And it's a very complex language. And so I'm learning that right now. And I feel like that's helping with my cognitive process. I write, and I think that helps. So I do think that there are things we can do to increase our cognitive aptitude, right?
Yeah, and I know I don't want to speak about it too much on here because I have spoke about it in other podcasts, but I'm part of Dr. Lisa Mosconi's research and into the brain changes through menopause, and she essentially says the brain's super smart and it rebounds and regrows, and it was something that I had the same type of experience, like literal words. And it wasn't even just like, it was embarrassing things where I would speak to someone, be introduced to their name, and then go to speak to them and go, have I forgotten the name or did I just not listen? And both are equally as bad. And I feel like that sort of extreme cognitive issues I was having have resolved themselves, and I can at least have a conversation right now.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Some of the other things that testosterone did help with, honestly, were joint pain and some increase in libido. And so those were really great. And now that I'm not using the testosterone, the joint pain is definitely back. But I feel like my libido is a little bit more recovered than it had been before the testosterone. I think I just needed that period of time where
start almost. Yeah. And I think that's always a work in progress.
Absolutely. And it's so complex. Again, one of those really sexual responses, just so complex.
I've just interviewed Dr. Kelly Casperson all about this. And the minute we start removing this singular reason that we maybe lose our libido, the better, because it requires work and a multifaceted approach to it, right? So, okay. So going back to queer menopause, when I was doing a little bit of reading prior to the conversation with you, I was reading about gender, sex, and relationship diversity, right? And I feel good that I wrote that down, and I had a little dig deeper to find out what that means. Can you explain to people where I'm going with this so that at least the language is becoming more familiar to us?
So you would like to know more about the distinction between gender, sex, and relationality?
Yes, because okay. I think that's one of the big stumbling blocks for a lot of cisgender people is that they confuse gender and sex.
Yes, absolutely. So sex and gender are two different things, and then sexual orientation is yet a third distinct thing, right? Totally separate. In many cases, although I personally find in my reality that my gender expression and my sexual orientation have some interplay. And that may be the case for some people and not for others. So gender and sex, right? Sex is I like to say sex is like the hardware and gender is the software, is one analogy that I use. I want to say, though, about sex, biological sex or whatever you want to call it, is more complex than we like to think it is, or than many like to think it is. Sex is not a binary either. Male, female, there's intersex. And there are actually a number of different variations between those sort of points on the spectrum, genetically and biologically. There are a myriad combination of sexual attributes or chromosomes that a person can have. So even if we boil it down to just the basic biological distinction, sex is complex. And then gender. Now, gender is very flexible for many of us. It's flexible culturally, even. If we think of like the color pink meaning female, for example, there was a time even in this country that pink actually was a masculine color. And so just our interpretations of gender and gender expression is fluid culturally. They're also gender is also like a culturally bound concept.
Agreed. Right? Yes.
So gender expression is going to be different from culture to culture. There are pre-contact cultures, so indigenous cultures that to this day still recognize more than two genders. There is a lot of gender diversity in many indigenous civilizations and cultures. And I think India recognizes a third gender legally, and we're working toward that in the States, right? We have non-binary or an other category for driver's licenses in California, right?
And it just says other in Canada too, actually.
Right.
On government documentation, yeah.
Right. So there's a non-binary option in some states and some countries. Gender is fluid. It's right. And if we just look at the progress of our language around gender in this culture, right, we were talking about our kids getting it and being able to understand it right off the bat and not having the trips around it that we in an older generation might have. And my kiddo, who's transmasculine, non-binary, and is 23, coming up on 23 now, came out as non-binary 8 years ago.
I read your Facebook post about this the other day. Yeah.
Right? 8 years ago, long time ago. So, and they were kind of like at the front end of that curve. And I remember having a conversation with them. I came out as non-binary later than them. And I remember having a conversation. They had been identifying as transmasculine, male identified, for about a year at that point. And they came to the realization after they had top surgery, which they really wanted, and they still are super happy that they had top surgery, they came to the realization that was enough for them. And they didn't want to be on hormones, and they didn't want to go further in the process of masculinization, right? And they realized that they were non-binary at that point. And I remember talking to them about that and saying, that's going to be a complicated one, because we're going to have to, and they were under 18. So we are going to have to explain it to doctors and medical professionals. And it's going to be a process of education ongoingly. And they're
ongoing. Yes. Ongoing for the rest of their life, probably.
Right. And they were like, what do you want me to do? Like, it's not something that I can change. It's my identity. I was like, okay, got it. So we did start educating medical professionals about it at that point. And when they were still under 18 and I would go to their appointments with them, I would take that on as my job, because I didn't want that to fall on them. Right. So our kids are progressive in this way. They have a head start on us. And I think we can learn a lot from them around what all of that, about how we can engage with that process, about the level of curiosity that it takes to maintain like openness to that process. Sorry for the noise in the background. It's garbage day. Hope it's not too loud.
real life podcast. Don't worry about it. So, just moving on from that slightly. So when I would talk about like the queer menopause, I talk about the LGBTQ plus, because I find that easier to remember rather than all of because there's new letters, but that's something that's fluid as well. And I was reading about some terms that we shouldn't use anymore. And I know you said that this maybe changes from person to person and that you speak to. And I was reading that there are now outdated terms that we shouldn't use. Yeah, I still hear them, things like trans man and female to man. And I'm wondering, because opinions seem to change, are there just some simple rules that we should just know? Things you shouldn't say? I think like an idiot's guide to this, essentially, because the deeper I was digging, the more I was like, I am really just going to mess up every time I open my mouth. That's how I felt.
Sure. I hear that. I mean, I would say the biggest don't ask people's plans for surgery. Don't ask.
People do that?
Yes, people absolutely do that. People also ask, well, what are you? Right? They want to know what's in your pants. And that's no one's business. So that is a big no. Do not ask what's in someone's pants unless you're actively sleeping with them. And even at that, you'll find out in good time. So, that's one of the big don'ts. I have a friend who identifies as a trans man. That's his identity. And I know for some, that's not the identity that they would take on. I have another friend who's younger who identifies as female. Right? And so I think to default to the identity that the person is presenting, right? So someone might identify as trans feminine or trans masculine or trans man or trans woman, right? Someone might identify that way. But the assumption is that that person identifies as a man or a woman or a non-binary person, right?
Is it okay to ask, how would you like to be addressed? How would you like to identify? Is that polite? Is that intrusive?
I think the best way to do it is to present your pronouns when you introduce yourself, right? Okay. So I would say, hi, I'm Lasara. My pronoun is they, them. That opens the conversation in a way that's not invasive.
Okay, that's great. And that just and then don't be afraid to be corrected if you say it wrong. And I think that that's how we learn, right? That's how I learn. And I'm that person that my husband says, you should make a mistake once and learn from it. And I'm like, no, every single day I do the same thing wrong and I continue to do it wrong, but eventually it sticks. I'd like to sort of finish up the conversation talking about representation. And here's why, because as a menopausal woman, I don't see myself represented, right? I don't see that as much as maybe I do a little bit more now, but typically it's the old lady in the rocking chair, or they'll talk about menopause products with a young 20, 30-year-old in it. That now we're starting to see more and more representation, but ageism definitely is a thing. And I personally, I'm tired of it. But then add in the fact that representation for queer menopause, it's really not there, right? And I was thinking about this. There's 2 programs I've watched recently within the last 2 weeks where non-binary was represented in an amazing way. And one of them was in Billions, the character Taylor, who is actually the best character in the show. And they did a really great way of helping us learn, and by the use of the right pronouns and the appropriate language, and the fact that Taylor always pulled people up when the right language wasn't used, including her own father. I really liked that, because I was like, okay, this is how it plays out potentially in the real life.
Their own father.
Oh, there you go. See, I did it again. Yeah, exactly. That's what's going to happen. And that's what's going to happen to me. I know me as a person, and I'm always going to trip up, but I want to be right. I want to do this right. The other program, I don't know if Elliot Page is non-binary, or I don't know how they identify actually
necessarily, but believe that they identify as male.
But the Umbrella Academy, again, did a really good job of writing that into the show and making it just an easy transition through the show as well. And I really like the way so I'm seeing more some representation in media, but really when it comes to queer menopause, especially when I look at the work that Tanya is doing, it's completely washed over. Nobody's talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is absolutely true. I do want to say a friend of mine wrote a book called What Fresh Hell Is This?
Oh, Karina.
Yes. And Karina is non-binary. So that book is written from a non-binary perspective.
I've actually wanted to speak to her for some time, only because people keep telling me how amazing the book is. But I didn't understand that was the perspective. And that's great. When I wrote my book, I don't touch on it at all. I wrote the book 4 years ago. And right. It's a huge missing chunk that I sort of have some regret, but it's just the way it goes.
Honestly, I get it. I have books that are out and I wrote them from a female perspective, and I missed the mark as well. My books were written, my most recent book was published in 2016. And then the one before that, 2005. So in 2005, we didn't even barely had the language, right? And I hadn't come out as non-binary. Actually, writing my second book was part of my process of coming to my gender identity in a more solid way.
Yeah.
So we're all going to get it wrong is the point. I mean, there was a group recently who was working with my second book, Jailbreaking the Goddess. And they wrote me an email because their reading group had a really negative reaction as non-binary and trans folks to the material. And knowing that I'm non-binary, they were like, what the hell? And so I got an email that was very direct and well thought out and asking me to basically explain myself. And I did. I explained myself and I said, yes, I take full responsibility for the lack of representation in this book. This is where I was at the time. This is where I'm at now. And if I had the opportunity, yes, I would absolutely rewrite, or I would write those books differently if I were writing them now. And books are a time capsule, right?
Yeah. Yeah. This is the evolution, right? The evolution of Lasara. Okay, as we finish off, what would you like to see happen next? Just as a broad stroke, what's needed?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, right, I think education of medical professionals would be a really good big stop. Maybe not the first step, maybe the first step. I don't know. But education, and that's something with the nonprofit that I work with that we are working on is educating. It's a queer nonprofit, mental health nonprofit in the Bay Area called Pacific Center for Human Growth. And we are an LGBTQ focused mental health organization, nonprofit. And we're working on expanding our training program to focus on education of medical professionals around queer visibility and affirmation. And so that is something that needs to be done. It needs to be done everywhere and without fail. It needs to be done across the spectrum of medical professionals. Every medical professional needs to understand the diversity of gender expression. And it's interesting because on the one hand, the medical profession recognizes, right, that gender affirmation is essential for the health and well-being of gender variant folks, right? That's
Right.
recognized. Yet the medical professional itself is not.
It's not practiced. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that's an interesting complexity. So that's one thing. I think also, and that would be a huge deal just across the board. I want to say Planned Parenthood is really good in this regard. Planned Parenthood is excellent in this regard.
Planned Parenthood are just excellent.
Yes, they are. They are excellent. I think also in the spaces like the group, right, having guidelines, right, that are explicitly affirmative, not just inclusive, right, but explicitly affirmative of gender variance. And I think you did a really great job of taking that situation into account, right? And that needs to happen. So that's a real strong allyship move. Right. Those spaces need to be inclusive and protected. And that'll be a slow process. It is very complicated for many people. Oh, this is the point I wanted to make earlier. As well as the menopause conversation, not having representation of queer identity, the birth conversation also lacks that complexity or linguistic ability or affirmative ability, right? And that's a huge argument in the midwifery community currently about the desire for queer folks to hear language about pregnant people, right? Because I have a male friend who's pregnant right now, literally. And so there are men who experience pregnancy at this point in our cultural evolution. And that really freaks some people out. And how hard do you think it is for that person to be experiencing their pregnancy in such not just an isolation, but being perceived as an enemy of sorts, right? Pregnancy is already so challenging culturally.
Well, especially in the US. I mean, right. I can't even imagine. Right. It's absolutely crazy.
So, yeah,
oh my God.
There are all these conversations that need to happen, and they're happening bit by bit. And I think the things that need to happen is like what you're doing, taking those steps when you see them available to you to create affirmative space like we're doing today.
Allyship. That's what you need, right? Mm-hmm. You need. So listen, I have so much I think I'm going to have this conversation with you and then take it away and sit and think about it. I think it's one of those type of conversations, and I like those because that's usually where my best thoughts happen after the event. You know, it's the same with an argument with my husband. I always have the best thoughts afterwards. But for anybody who is experiencing a queer menopause, or anybody that wants to learn more or just find resources, have you got, like, where can we find you? Where would you point them?
Well, I mean, while I am doing some education on non-binary identity, I'm actually doing a presentation in February in LA at an event on non-binary identity and sexual engagement, which is going to be interesting. I have not been doing a lot of education around non-binary menopause or queer menopause, but I would say Corinna with What Fresh Hell Is This is a great starting point. Also, I haven't seen the queer menopause site yet, but I think that sounds like an excellent resource. I think also a thing that we can do as queer folks experience experiencing menopause is that we can talk about it. And that's a huge thing. That's a huge thing, as folks don't talk about menopause easily. And there's even less of the conversation in some ways in the ability to have the conversation in queer spaces. So we're working toward changing that. And we all are, right? That's the work that we're doing. So, and I think when cis people go to their gynecologist, maybe they can say, women aren't the only ones who experience menopause as another step toward allyship.
Yeah. Like just the acknowledgement that this is a bigger space. The work I'm doing, some work outside of my own work here with a company called MyNaya. It's a new startup company that we're looking to do complete healthcare for menopause, like complete everything. It's not just a medical, as you know, it's the whole shebang. And the two medical advisors within the company are very much on board with, we need to look at this culturally as well as like from different gender perspectives. And so happy that I've got informed people that I'm working with and I'm learning from them all the time. I've learned a lot from you today. Thank you so much for coming on. I very much appreciate you taking the time, and just keep doing what you're doing. We obviously need it.
Thank you so much. And yeah, if people are looking to get in touch with me directly, they can email me at lasara.firefox.allen@gmail.com. Okay. And that's Allen is ALLEN.
I'll pop that in the show notes that that's available if you're okay sharing that.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. I'm also on Instagram at Lasara_Firefox_Allen. And I'm very active on Facebook, so people can find me there as well.
Find you there. Okay, well, thank you again. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I hope you got as much out of the conversation today as I did, and I look forward to next week's guest. Okay, take care. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you like what you hear, then why not subscribe to this podcast and leave me a review? You see, when you do this, it helps to raise the profile of my show and attract new listeners. And it also allows me to continue to deliver valuable content with great guests. And in return for you doing that, I will send you my 12-week core-focused program called Abs on Fire as a thank you. Simply drop me an email at amanda@amandathebe.com and I'll wing that your way. Bye.